Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger at bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, welcome your host, Jessica, with this podcast episode of Workology.
You might be surprised to know that this year is an election year and that last week was the Republican National Convention. On Monday, the first night of the RNC, there were 1.6 million tweets sent by 449,000 people in the U.S. And 9,900 tweets were sent in 1 minute during Melania Trump's infamous speech. My social media streams, probably like yours, were full of memes, strong opinions, and lots of video. But what are the real HR issues that are being discussed at both the Republican and Democratic National Conventions? That's what we're here to talk about today. Thanks for joining the Workology podcast. Today I'm joined with Lisa Horn, a lobbyist for SHRM, or the Society for Human Resource Management. Lisa, welcome to the Workology podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I was following you on Twitter this week and saw that you were tweeting at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland.
Yes.
What's it like to be at a national convention, whether it's the Democrat or the Republican convention? I mean, what's the atmosphere like, and what kind of people did you meet?
Well, it's a very exciting opportunity. This happened to be, in my capacity at SHRM, the fourth Republican National Convention that I've been a part of through my work at SHRM. And next week, as you mentioned, we'll be heading to the DNC for my fourth participation there as well. And it's a very exciting time. You're watching, your democracy play out in front of your eyes. Lots and delegates, enthusiasm, of course, lots of law enforcement, a lot of, media influence that is there. Just a really great opportunity for SHRM to, take our workplace principles that we have recently released and share them with these important, decision makers and media influencers, both in Cleveland and then again next week in Philly.
What are some of the themes that you saw kind of coming through at the Republican National Convention, and then also maybe walk us through some things that you're expecting at the Democratic National Convention?
Well, certainly workplace issues are front and center. The RNC had, a theme kind of each day, which I assume the DNC will too. You saw, picking up on Mr. Trump's, Make America Great Again. There was, Make America First again. And again, it's a theme each day. Workplace issues, competitiveness, immigration. We talked last night. We heard about equal pay issues or comp equity, workplace flexibility, the need to support working parents. And of course, healthcare, which is an issue that's very important to SHRM and to practitioners.
One of the things that I have been thinking a lot about, and it has been on the mind in some of our executive meetings at the advanced group, was the May and June's jobs report. So the May and June jobs report, and they're not as great maybe as they have been in previous months. Was this a topic of discussion at the Republican National Convention?
Not the jobs report specifically, but I think that there certainly was a focus, on the overall economy. The issue of the health of the American economy continues to weigh heavily on voters' minds on both sides of the aisle, whether Republican or Democrat. So I think, contained in each of the platforms, the candidates are, laying out their vision for how to continue to grow the economy. Certainly we've made progress in recent years, but as you allude to, the jobs report wasn't where everyone would have liked it. And so I think you're going to continue to see that issue play out on the campaign trail because, again, it is, by most of the polling out there, one of the top issues of concern to voters.
Why is it important for SHRM to have a presence at these national conventions?
It's a great opportunity on such a major stage to put the HR profession front and center in front of policymakers, so that we show them and demonstrate our thought leadership on these key workplace and workforce issues, and letting them know where we stand on these issues. And then when they get back to Washington, or as the next president of the United States, they continue to call upon us for our expertise and input as they develop public policy. It's just an amazing stage, and to my knowledge, SHRM was the only HR group that was in Cleveland and going to be in Philly.
What's the reception like when you're talking to the policymakers, you're having these conversations with thought leaders and media about human resources and its role in the organization?
I think that it's generally a positive. There's always some, interest in learning more about the whole, the profession itself. And again, because of the national spotlight on the conventions, it provides a great opportunity to shed some light on the importance of HR professionals and the role that they play in their organizations, and the strategies that they employ for successful organizations.
What kind of questions do you get asked just in having these conversations? I mean, I would be curious to know.
I think sometimes, and you've probably heard this before, that what exactly does HR do? Are they just the people that hire and fire people? No, but when you start talking about like the issues that we care about, the healthcare, for example, that it's practitioners and it's HR professionals, the ones that are responsible kind of for designing and implementing healthcare plans, that meet the needs of the organization and their workforce, and that HR professionals are the ones that design workplace flexibility strategies. So I think that it's just offering them the diversity of the roles that HR professionals play within their organizations is really where the conversations usually go, that it's, opening their eyes that it's much more than just, the individual who hires and fires at an organization.
I think that's an ongoing battle and struggle for all of us out in the field as practitioners, is people make assumptions that that's really all we do. So you guys are talking to policymakers and the media and telling them, hey, we're more than just the guys and gals who do the hiring and firing. We're involved in really the infrastructure of the business.
Absolutely. That is exactly the message that we deliver, and that critical role that HR professionals play. And it's, again, a great opportunity at the conventions to do that at a very high level.
You mentioned healthcare. Let's talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act. I know that there are lots of changes happening right now, and that many of us business leaders are concerned with this election that things might change. Was that a topic of conversation that was discussed? And if it was, what kind of things are you hearing?
Yeah, the Affordable Care Act continues to be a topic of conversation for policymakers, as well as, SHRM's involved in those discussions. And while you may hear a lot of banter, I think, on the campaign trail, that if a Republican is elected, that Congress is going to, look to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that's just not, I just don't see that happening. The Affordable Care Act is here to stay. Certainly, there's a lot of talk about amending it or possibly improving it. And, we saw a victory on that front at the end of last year, when one of SHRM's policy priorities with respect to the ACA, the excise tax, was delayed for 2 years. So that was, a victory, and we continue to push for repeal of the excise tax. So you'll see incremental, I think, improvements and policy suggestions on improvements, but you're not going to see a full-scale repeal of the ACA. Again, I think you hear that play out a little bit in the rhetoric on the campaign trail, but I just don't see a path forward for that.
It's hard sometimes as HR practitioners to sort of understand or really kind of work through all the media information, and then of course stuff that's being shared and said on Twitter and Facebook. So and that's really why I wanted to talk with you today, because it's really overwhelming to think about all the content that's being shared in relation to these two conventions. How do you suggest HR practitioners where do they go to be able to find, I don't know, the light at the end of the tunnel with all this stuff that's out there?
Yeah, certainly there's as you said, a lot of stuff coming at HR professionals in terms of news, and some more right-leaning or left-leaning, and it can be difficult to decipher, fact and fiction. I certainly encourage HR professionals to stay attuned to a publication we put out, the HR Issues Update, through the Government Affairs team at SHRM. We try to break down the latest policy developments, and it's a biweekly electronic newsletter that goes out to SHRM members, key policy developments, absent the rhetoric. We don't think that helps anyone in using a great deal of political rhetoric. So we try to lay out policy developments in the HR space for our members in a rhetoric-free environment. In addition, we've got a policy action center, advocacy.shrm.org, that has a plethora of policy information on key HR issues that we're working on. So you'll see an entire page right now dedicated to the overtime issue, and certainly opportunities to weigh in and advocate when it comes to healthcare developments or compensation equity. So those are a couple of resources that we make available through SHRM that I think can be helpful to HR professionals.
I appreciate that. It's so crazy because when I'm trying to do my job as an HR practitioner, kind of cut through the noise, and I don't want to take a stance. If I need to implement the Affordable Care Act or the Fair Labor Standards Act changes, I'm not taking sides, Republican or Democrat. And I was on this webinar that I hosted a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the ACA changes and what it means for HR practitioners, and somebody came on the line, touting, anti-Obama sort of topics. And it's really hard, I think, sometimes, because I had to say to this person, actually banned him from the webinar. I was like, hey, this is politics free. We're just talking about the changes that need to be made and what businesses and also HR is going to be responsible for.
No, that's a really good point. We're seeing that, right now with the overtime debate. Certainly SHRM has a strong advocacy stance in trying to, push for, a legislative solution to mitigate the impact on organizations of this new overtime rule, because we think it went too far too fast, even though we supported an increase in the salary threshold. But at the same time, while we have an advocacy push there, we are providing the tools and resources and information to HR professionals to make sure that they are ready to come into compliance with this new rule that's due to be effective, absent any delay or legislative solution we could find on December 1. So we have that dual track there. While we're advocating for some improvements, we also have to make sure that practitioners are ready, again, to have their organizations in compliance with this rule come December 1.
Yeah, and it's sometimes really hard to work through all that. But I appreciate that you guys are providing resources and being a voice for HR practitioners out there, in the government and among policymakers, because sometimes, as we talked about, they really just don't understand how much of an undertaking it is right now to make that change with the Fair Labor Standards Act.
That's absolutely right. And, I take my role as HR professional's voice in Washington very seriously, as do my other colleagues at SHRM. It's a great privilege, and one that is such an important voice in workplace policy, because so few of our policymakers have an HR background. I think there's only really a handful that do. So it's very important for us to have a voice, and also for our members to weigh in with their lawmakers through our advocacy efforts and via SHRM 18.
Let's take a bit of a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast, powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is all about workplace issues and HR issues, live from the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention with Lisa Horn. You can follow Lisa on Twitter at Sherm Lobbyist Lisa. That's SHRMLOBBYISTLISA. Before we close out the podcast, I wanted to talk a little bit more about paid leave, because before we went online, you talked and said that was sort of a theme that you saw in a lot of conversations being had at the Republican National Convention. Can you walk us through some of those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of paid leave has, taken on kind of new meaning in recent years. It's an issue that certainly Secretary Clinton is advocating for paid family leave on the campaign trail. Republicans have, by and large, taken an opposite approach to what Secretary Clinton has laid out, and some others on the Democratic side have advocated for mandated paid leave, whether you make the Family Medical Leave Act, it's currently unpaid, as you know, make it a paid FMLA leave, or you're looking at paid sick leave mandates, et cetera. There's been a real interest in mandating paid leave. And of course, Republicans have opposed those efforts and have pursued things like tax credits or possibly other incentives to get more employers to offer paid leave. From SHRM's perspective, I think an overwhelming number of employers already offer paid leave voluntarily, and we've been pursuing workplace policy solutions that would hopefully incentivize more employers to offer paid leave and workplace flexibility options absent a mandate, by providing them some additional regulatory relief. And we've been working on a policy proposal now for several months with some members of Congress, and we hope to actually see legislation introduced when Congress comes back this fall. Even though it's a very limited time, they'll be here before they hit the campaign trail. We hope to see legislation introduced that SHRM again has had a key role in developing.
Interesting, and I mean, much needed, I think, for sort of everybody has an opinion about paid leave. Everybody has a different way of doing it, so it would be nice to have sort of a standard or some guidelines. Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, by and large, most SHRM members agree that organizations should offer paid leave. It's an important recruitment and retention strategy, job satisfaction, et cetera. The challenge with one-size-fits-all mandates is that, it doesn't kind of recognize the diversity of workplaces or workforces that all have kind of different needs. So they tend to limit the flexibility of employers in offering kind of innovative, paid leave options. So looking at ways to incentivize more to do it versus, rigid mandates is preferable from SHRM's perspective.
Wonderful. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Well, certainly SHRM.org is a great resource. I'm also one of the featured bloggers on the SHRM blog, which is blog.shrm.org. And in fact, my colleagues and I have been blogging from the Republican National Convention, in addition to some of the tweets that you tweeting, and we'll be blogging again next week at the DNC. So if you want to check out that blog and see what we're up to there, it's a handy resource.
Awesome. Well, we'll include your Twitter in the transcript, and then also a link to several of the blogs, Republican and Democratic National Convention. So I look forward to hearing more from you as you head on out to Philadelphia.
Looking forward to it. Always an exciting time.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you to you, the listener, for joining us today on the Workology podcast, where we discuss the art and science of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs for all our previous Workology podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill, provided by TotalPicture.com.